Leaded gasoline is remembered as one of the great engineering breakthroughs of the 20th century. It powered the cars, planes, and trucks that built the modern world. For most of that century, almost nobody questioned it. But leaded gasoline was one of the most dangerous substances ever released into the global environment on a mass scale. And the company responsible for selling it would spend half a century, 5 full decades, suppressing the science that proved it was slowly poisoning every living thing within reach of a road. The Ethyl Corporation, a joint venture of General Motors, Standard Oil, and DuPont, would fund fraudulent research, blacklist inconvenient scientists, sue the federal government to keep lead legal, and go on selling it for 6 decades after they already knew exactly what it was doing to human brains. Workers would go insane and die in the first years of production. Children across 2 generations would lose IQ points they would never recover. Economists would later find that the crime wave that tore through American cities in the 1970s and 1980s was substantially a product of lead poisoning, a catastrophe that would cost the country trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of lives. And behind all of it was one man, a charming, brilliant engineer from Ohio, who would also go on to invent the chemical that punched a hole in the planet's ozone layer. This is the story of Thomas Midgley Jr., the Ethyl Corporation, and the most catastrophic chemistry in history. To understand how we got here, we have to go back to Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania. The year is 1889. Thomas Midgley Jr. was born into a family for whom invention was something close to a calling. His father was an inventor. His maternal grandfather had invented the inserted tooth saw, a device still used in lumber mills today. The Midgley household did not treat invention as a career. It treated it as a way of seeing the world, as the assumption that if something was broken, a smart person could fix it, and that fixing things was among the highest uses of a human life. The family would eventually move to Columbus, Ohio, and it was there that Thomas would grow up watching the world transform at a pace that would have seemed miraculous just 1 generation earlier. The automobile was turning from a novelty into a necessity. Factories were reshaping American cities overnight. Chemistry was becoming, for the first time in history, a force capable of altering civilization at scale. For a boy who had inherited the family obsession with how things worked and why, it was a remarkable moment to be alive. Midgley enrolled at Cornell University in 1907 and took to mechanical engineering with the natural intensity of someone who had never needed to be talked into caring about their subject. He was social, funny, and easy to like. Not the solitary laboratory type, but the kind of man who could hold a room and explain a complicated idea with the ease of describing the weather. Colleagues who would later work alongside him would remember him as generous, warm, and almost recklessly enthusiastic. At Cornell, he would found the university's first aviation club because it hadn't occurred to him that someone else should do it first. He graduated in 1911. For a few years, he would drift, drafting machines at the National Cash Register Company, then working at his father's automobile tire business. Capable, productive, going nowhere in particular. Capable in the way that a man with an exceptional engine is capable when the car hasn't yet found the right road. That changed in 1916 when Thomas Midgley joined the research division of General Motors, or more precisely, when he met Charles Kettering. Charles Kettering, Boss Kett to every engineer who worked under him, was one of the great engineering minds of the early 20th century, having already invented the electric automobile starter. He was relentlessly demanding and constitutionally optimistic about what ingenuity could achieve. He and Midgley would develop an immediate rapport, 2 men who saw the world as a series of problems awaiting elegant solutions. And Kettering had a problem he could not solve. The problem was engine knock. When gasoline ignited in an engine cylinder, it was supposed to burn in a single controlled wave, but under the wrong conditions, high compression, poor quality fuel, the fuel-air mixture would detonate prematurely, producing a sharp metallic bang that robbed the engine of power, damaged its components, and placed a hard ceiling on how efficient or powerful any automobile could ever become. Every manufacturer in America was fighting it. Nobody had found a solution that worked reliably at scale. Kettering believed the answer was chemical, some compound, added to gasoline in small quantities, that would change how the fuel burned. He believed Thomas Midgley was the man to find it. He would be right, but the search would take years, and what it would eventually find would set in motion consequences that neither of them could have imagined. Midgley would spend the next 2 years testing compounds with the methodical patience of someone who treated each failure as a piece of information rather than a defeat. He would test iodine, he would test aniline, he would test ethanol, benzene, and dozens of obscure organic compounds that showed early promise and then disappointed at scale. The work was slow, expensive, and frequently discouraging. But Midgley was not a man who discouraged easily, and in December 1921, he found what he was looking for: tetraethyl lead, a compound of lead bonded to 4 carbon chains, eliminated engine knock almost entirely when added to gasoline in small quantities. The effect was immediate, repeatable, and dramatic. The engine ran smooth and powerfully and efficiently. Midgley would run the tests again and again and get the same result every time. This was, without question, a genuine achievement. Tetraethyl lead would transform the economics of the automobile industry. It would make modern aviation fuel possible. It would help power the Allied air forces through the Second World War. Midgley would receive the Nichols Medal from the American Chemical Society, the Perkin Medal, and eventually the presidency of the society itself. He had transformed, in less than a decade, from a middling industrial draftsman into the most celebrated applied chemist in American industry. But to turn this discovery into a mass-market product, someone would have to figure out how to manufacture it at scale, in factories, in large quantities, handled by ordinary workers day after day. And this is where the first shadow would fall. Tetraethyl lead is extraordinarily toxic. Unlike most lead compounds, it passes through the skin directly into the bloodstream without requiring ingestion. It migrates rapidly to the brain and nervous system. Even brief exposure at significant quantities can cause hallucinations, mania, and seizures. Prolonged exposure causes irreversible neurological damage. And in the early 1920s, almost no one brought in to handle it industrially had been told any of this. Midgley himself would be among the first to experience what it could do. By 1922, he had been working closely with tetraethyl lead long enough that his health was failing in ways he could no longer ignore. He would write to a colleague that his lungs had been affected and that he needed to drop all work and get a large supply of fresh air. He would spend 6 months recovering in Miami, letting his body slowly clear what the compound had done to it. Could Midgley really keep this secret and return to the same work? Would General Motors have let him walk away from a discovery worth hundreds of millions of dollars? These are questions Midgley seems to have answered privately in the most convenient possible direction. He returned, and he told almost no one what had happened. This is the moment where the shape of everything that would follow becomes visible. Midgley did not stop. He did not raise the alarm internally. He did not tell the Ethyl Corporation that scaling up production posed a public health risk that needed to be addressed before any more plants were built. He managed the information the way a man manages a secret he has convinced himself isn't really a secret, by not looking at it directly. In private correspondence from this period, he would write that he found himself becoming more or less worried about lead entering the atmosphere from automobile exhaust. He noted the possibility that lead particles could accumulate in the soil near roads. He speculated briefly about what this could mean over time, and then he set those worries aside, because there was work to be done and a commercial opportunity that no one in the room was willing to sacrifice for a concern that couldn't yet be quantified. Remember that, because it comes back. There is something worth pausing on here, because it is easy to let Midgley off the hook as a man who simply didn't know. But the records say otherwise. As far back as 1922, Midgley had written to a business associate about his concerns regarding lead accumulating in the atmosphere near roads, using the words "more or less worried." He noted the problem was worth investigating, and then, faced with the commercial weight of what he had built, the expectations of General Motors, the investment already in place, he set those concerns aside and moved forward. This is not the behavior of a man who didn't know. This is the behavior of a man who knew and chose not to look. In the world of industrial chemistry in the 1920s, the only people with the access and funding to study the long-term effects of tetraethyl lead were the same people who would profit from its sale. There was only what the industry chose to investigate, funded by the industry that had already decided on the answer. In 1923, General Motors, Standard Oil of New Jersey, and DuPont would formalize the commercial opportunity by creating the Ethyl Corporation, a joint venture whose sole purpose would be to manufacture, market, and defend tetraethyl lead. It was a corporate structure designed for a long life, and it would have one. The plants were built, the workers were hired, and in the autumn of 1924, at Standard Oil's refinery in Bayway, New Jersey, something went badly wrong. Workers at the Bayway plant would begin hallucinating. Some would burst into violent mania. Others would sit quietly and then collapse. In a matter of weeks, 5 workers would die. Dozens more would be hospitalized with neurological damage that would never fully heal. The small brick building where tetraethyl lead was processed had earned a name among the workforce, the Looney Gas Building. New Jersey state authorities would shut the Bayway plant down. The story would reach the newspapers, and the reporters would come looking for Thomas Midgley Jr. What happened at that press conference in October 1924 was, by any measure, an act of extraordinary nerve. Midgley poured a solution of tetraethyl lead over his hands. He held the flask to his nose and inhaled deeply. He looked at the cameras and declared calmly that a person could repeat this demonstration every single day without experiencing any harmful effects whatsoever. The danger, he said, had been greatly exaggerated. I want you to hold that image for a moment. What none of the reporters knew was that the man at that podium had spent 6 months the previous year recovering from lead poisoning. He had written it in his own letters. His lungs had been damaged. He had taken months away to survive it, and he poured it on his hands and called it safe. Up until this point, I think you could read Midgley's story as something almost tragic, a brilliant man caught between what he knew and what he needed to believe. I know I found myself wanting to. That kind of human failure is almost understandable. But here is where the story takes a much darker turn. Because what happened after Bayway was not an accident, and it was not a single man's mistake. It was a strategy, and the strategy would run for 50 years. In May 1925, the US Surgeon General convened a national conference to determine the fate of tetraethyl lead. The government's own experts would describe the question as probably the greatest single question in the field of public health that has ever faced the American public. Before the conference opened, the Ethyl Corporation made a move that would prove to be a masterpiece of corporate theater. They voluntarily withdrew tetraethyl lead from the market, positioning themselves as cooperative citizens who simply wanted the matter settled scientifically. It worked. The committee deliberated for 6 hours and 45 minutes. On January 19, 1926, it found no good grounds for prohibiting the sale of leaded gasoline. Ethyl gasoline would go back on sale, and it would stay on sale for the next 60 years. Midgley himself would move on to his next problem. In 1930, working with Frigidaire and DuPont, he would develop a new refrigerant, dichloro-difluoromethane, which he would call Freon. Non-toxic, non-flammable, and chemically stable. At the 1930 meeting of the American Chemical Society, he would breathe in a lungful of Freon vapor and exhale it toward a candle flame, which went out harmlessly. The room would applaud. Within 5 years, over 8 million American refrigerators would run on it. A second miracle, a second triumph. And though it would take decades to understand, a second catastrophe in the making. Midgley would die in November 1944, at 55, of complications following polio. Partially paralyzed, he would design a system of ropes and pulleys to help himself in and out of bed. He would die tangled in that system, killed in the end by one of his own inventions. He would never know about the ozone layer. He would never know about the crime wave. He would never know what his two greatest achievements would cost the people who came after him. But the institution he had helped build would carry on, and it would do far worse. With Midgley gone, the defense of leaded gasoline would pass to an entity far more durable and more methodical than any individual: the Ethyl Corporation's scientific apparatus. The centerpiece of this apparatus was a man named Robert Kehoe. In 1925, Kehoe would become the Ethyl Corporation's chief medical consultant. In 1930, with funding from General Motors, Ethyl Corporation, and DuPont, he would open the Kettering Laboratory of Applied Physiology at the University of Cincinnati. It would become one of the most influential toxicology laboratories in the country, funded almost entirely by the industries whose products it was supposed to evaluate. Kehoe would run the Kettering Laboratory for 35 years. His scientific contribution was elegant in its cynicism. Kehoe would argue that the burden of proof lay with the critics, until someone could demonstrate conclusively that lead at general population exposure levels caused measurable harm. There was no basis for regulation. Critics would later call this the Kehoe paradigm, a methodology that effectively demanded the kind of certainty that could only be produced slowly, expensively, and only by researchers who could secure funding from an industry simultaneously managing the outcome. For 35 years, the Kettering Laboratory would produce studies. They would find tolerable thresholds. They would reach conclusions that, with remarkable consistency, aligned with the commercial interests of the institutions funding them. And for 35 years, regulators would largely defer to those conclusions. Meanwhile, DuPont would distribute Freon through every refrigerator and air conditioner manufacturer in America. By the 1950s, chlorofluorocarbons would be circulating through hundreds of millions of homes. The instrument of the second catastrophe was already embedded in the infrastructure of ordinary life. All it needed was time. The institution that Midgley had helped build was now too large and too profitable to be challenged by a single study or a single scientist. It would take someone unusually stubborn and unusually brilliant to force the question into the open. His name was Claire Patterson. In the early 1950s, Patterson was a young geochemist at the University of Chicago, trying to calculate the age of the Earth by measuring uranium to lead ratios in ancient meteorite samples. He had nothing to do with leaded gasoline. He was working on one of the most technically demanding measurements in the history of science, a problem so precise it required him to work in conditions free of any atmospheric contamination. But his samples kept coming back saturated with lead, far more than the geological context could explain. Patterson would build one of the first clean rooms in scientific history, sealing his instruments from the surrounding air. The contamination would not stop, because it was not coming from his laboratory. It was coming from the world outside. Patterson would spend years tracing the source. By comparing lead concentrations in modern samples against those preserved in polar ice cores and deep ocean sediment from before the industrial era, he would eventually calculate something that stopped him cold. Modern Americans were carrying approximately 100 times more lead in their blood than their pre-industrial ancestors. 100 times. Not a marginal elevation, not a statistical anomaly, an order of magnitude contamination of the entire human food chain that had no natural precedent in recorded history. He would publish his findings in September 1965, and then the Ethel Corporation's network would move against him with everything it had. The United States Public Health Service would refuse to renew his research contracts. In 1971, he would be excluded from a National Research Council panel on atmospheric lead contamination, despite being the foremost expert on the subject in the world. Industry-funded researchers would publish papers dismissing his work as alarmist and methodologically flawed. His non-industry funding would disappear almost entirely. Patterson would spend 20 years fighting. He would lose most of those years, but he would not stop. In 1976, the EPA would finally begin phasing lead out of gasoline. The Ethel Corporation would immediately sue. Ethel Corporation versus EPA would go to the US Court of Appeals. The company would lose, but the litigation would buy time. And time, the ability to delay, to demand more studies, to require higher standards of proof, was the one resource the Ethel Corporation had learned to weaponize most effectively. Here is the math on what those decades of delay actually cost. Tetraethyl lead entered the American market in 1923. Its use in on-road vehicles would finally be banned in 1986, with all remaining uses eliminated in 1996. 73 years. Think about what that number means. During those 73 years, every car burning leaded gasoline would release fine lead particles from its exhaust pipe. Those particles would not disperse harmlessly. They would settle into the soil of every American neighborhood, park, and schoolyard near a road. They would accumulate in the dust that collected on floors and windowsills. They would enter the bodies of children who crawled on those floors and played in those parks. Children who could not have chosen otherwise, who had no idea, who would carry the consequences their entire lives. By the late 1970s, the average American child had blood lead levels that, by modern CDC standards, would qualify as clinically elevated. Studies would find a direct correlation between childhood blood lead and standardized test performance, with researchers estimating that widespread lead exposure from gasoline had suppressed average American IQ by 2 to 5 points, a cost economists would model in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And yet, the Ethel Corporation's primary argument was that no one had conclusively proven lead from gasoline exhaust was causing this harm. The Kehoe paradigm at work, the burden of proof inverted, the definition of certainty set high enough that it would always remain just out of reach. Economist Rick Nevin would find, in research published in the early 2000s, that per capita gasoline lead consumption explained approximately 90% of the variation in violent crime rates, with a 23-year lag. A child exposed to peak lead in 1965 would reach young adulthood by 1988. The crime wave that devastated American cities in the late 1980s and early 1990s would track almost perfectly with peak childhood lead exposure 2 decades earlier. Economist Jessica Reyes would calculate that the phase out of lead from gasoline accounted for approximately 56% of the decline in violent crime between 1992 and 2002, not a contributing factor. 56%. The Ethyl Corporation, General Motors, Standard Oil, and DuPont would pay $0 in criminal penalties for any of this. And while all of that was unfolding on the ground, the second of Midgley's inventions was working quietly overhead. In 1974, chemists Frank Rowland and Mario Molina would publish research in Nature showing that chlorofluorocarbons were migrating into the stratosphere and catalyzing the breakdown of ozone molecules. In 1985, British researchers would discover a hole in the ozone layer over Antarctica the size of North America. The Montreal Protocol of 1987 would begin the global phase out of CFCs, and the ozone hole has been slowly healing since. But CFC molecules, once released, persist in the upper atmosphere for 50 to 100 years. The freon produced through the middle decades of the 20th century is still working its way through the stratosphere. The historian J.R. McNeill, in his environmental history of the 20th century, would conclude that Thomas Midgley Jr. had more impact on the atmosphere than any other single organism in Earth's history. He was not exaggerating. So here is where all of this lands. Here is where it touches your life. The last country on Earth to ban leaded fuel was Algeria in July 2021, 100 years after Thomas Midgley found his solution in a Dayton laboratory. The world finally stopped burning it. If you were alive that year, you were alive for the centennial of one of the most costly decisions in the history of industrial civilization. The CDC estimates that approximately 500,000 American children currently have blood lead levels above the threshold that triggers clinical concern. There is no safe level of lead exposure for a child. There is no treatment that reverses neurological damage once done. The children being harmed right now are not being harmed by leaded gasoline. They are being harmed by the lead that settled into the soil and the paint and the water pipes of the homes and neighborhoods built during the decades when it was burning in every car on every road. That lead is still there. In your city. If your neighborhood was built close to a major road before 1990, the soil around that road almost certainly contains measurable lead from decades of vehicle exhaust. If your home was built before 1978, the paint on your walls may contain lead that was added as a pigment stabilizer, a second legacy of the same industry, the same era. If your municipality still runs water through old metal infrastructure, there is a reasonable chance that infrastructure contains lead that leaches into the water that comes out of your tap. You are likely living within range of at least one of these sources. You may be living within range of all three. The crime statistics of the 1980s and 1990s, the incarceration of a generation, the destruction of urban neighborhoods, the war on drugs that cost hundreds of billions of dollars and produced generational trauma that researchers are still measuring, all of it runs through, in significant part, the decision made in 1923 by 3 corporations to add lead to gasoline, and the decision made every year after 1924 to keep selling it. The ozone layer is recovering. Scientists project it will return to 1980 levels around 2060. The CFC molecules already in the stratosphere will continue their work until then. A catastrophe that began in 1930 will not fully resolve in your lifetime. When you look at your children's school, if it sits near a highway, you are looking at a building in a zone of elevated historical lead exposure. When you read about the gaps in childhood development between low-income and high-income urban neighborhoods, gaps that persist even when you control for poverty and school quality. You are looking, in part, at the physical legacy of a decision made by a committee of corporate lawyers a century ago. You are still living in it. Most of us are. We simply didn't know whose signature was on the original paperwork. Here is what that actually means for your life, not as a historical footnote, as a physical reality in the place where you live right now. If your neighborhood sits near a major road that carried heavy traffic before 1990, the soil around that road almost certainly contains elevated lead. The parks where your children play routinely test above the EPA's recommended threshold. You cannot see it. You cannot smell it. It settles into dust, gets tracked inside on shoes, and is inhaled as fine particles on dry days. It enters children's bodies and interferes with the brain chemistry that is still actively forming. Think about your water. Approximately 10 million American homes are still connected to the water supply through lead service lines, pipes installed through the mid-20th century because lead is pliable and durable and was not considered a problem until it undeniably was. When water sits in those pipes, it leaches lead. If your municipality's corrosion control is aging or inadequate, and many are, the water coming out of your tap may carry lead above the EPA action threshold. You may be drinking from one of those systems right now. There is no color, no taste, no warning. You didn't choose any of this. Your parents didn't choose it. Your grandparents, who bought their homes on streets that seemed quiet and safe in 1965, didn't choose it. These were decisions made by executives and lobbyists and industry-funded scientists, people who understood the risk well enough to systematically suppress the evidence of them. People who are gone now, whose names appear only in congressional investigation records and environmental history footnotes, while the consequences remain in your soil, your pipes, your water, and the neurological legacy of every child raised in a neighborhood where their blood lead levels were elevated before they were old enough to ask why. Thomas Midgley Jr. died in November 1944, tangled in a system of ropes and pulleys he had designed to help himself out of bed after polio had paralyzed his legs. The same mind that produced two world-altering inventions produced, in the end, the mechanism of his own death. There is something that stays with you about that. A man who spent his entire career solving problems brilliantly, at extraordinary scale, with genuine ingenuity, undone by one of his own solutions. The historian McNeill said Midgley had more impact on the atmosphere than any other single organism in Earth's history. By all accounts, Midgley was not an evil man. He was an exceptionally talented engineer working inside systems that rewarded him for solving the problems immediately in front of him. And that never required him, never even encouraged him, to look carefully at what those solutions would cost everyone else further downstream. Maybe that is the most unsettling thing about this whole story. Not that Midgley was monstrous, not that the executives at General Motors and Standard Oil were uniquely wicked. What is unsettling is how little any of that changes the outcome. The things we own have histories. The fuel that powered a century, the refrigerant that cooled our grandparents' food. They were sold to us as solutions, and they were solutions to real problems, built with real ingenuity. They just created larger problems downstream, in ways that no one who profited from them was willing to admit. That is the thing about the things you own. They almost always cost more than the price on the tag.